So decision trees are probably one of the most simplest machine learning algorithms, yet they are used everywhere because of their robustness and their interpretability. The idea behind a decision tree is very simple. You have some data that you want to classify into two categories, let's say category 1 or category 2, and you have multiple features in this data, f1, f2, and so on and so forth. You build a tree-like structure from this data, and at each node you ask a question about that data, that whether a given feature value crosses a given threshold or not. If the feature value crosses that threshold, you traverse the right hand side of the tree. If it does not, you traverse the left hand side of the tree. Eventually you run into one of the leaf nodes where the data will either be classified as C1 or C2 depending upon your problem. So now the question is, how do we build a decision tree and how do we learn these thresholds from a given data set? So let's jump in and code this up from scratch. So the first thing we need to code is a container for these nodes in the tree. And these nodes should hold three pieces of information. The first is about which feature are we asking the question. So from feature 1, 2, 3, 4, which feature is under consideration, what is the threshold for that feature, and whether this given node is a leaf node or not. So let's go ahead and code that up first. Let's call it tree node, and upon initialization we need three things. So feature index, feature threshold. Initially we'll set all the nodes to not being leaf nodes, and while we are training we'll assign appropriate values of whether a given node is a leaf node or not. Let's go ahead and run that. Next comes the main class of our decision tree. So let's define that class now. Decision tree. So initially the tree that we are training would be empty, so I'm going to set that as none. We also don't know the number of features on which we are training, so I'm just going to set that as -1. And we also don't know the number of classes, so I'm going to set that also as empty. Alright, next comes the method that we'll use to train our tree. I'm just going to call it fit because that's what it's called in most machine learning frameworks. And this will take x and y as input. So x being the input data that you have on which you want to train the tree, and y being the classes corresponding to each item in that data. Let's add some assertions in, make sure that the lengths match. We have the same number of classes as we have samples, and we want this to then build the tree. So we'll make another method for it and we'll call it build. Right, so let's go ahead and now write that build method. Now what does the build method do? The build method finds what is the best way to split the given data at any point in the node, right? So let's write a function to find that best feature to split on. So I'm gonna say that best split is found using another method called find best split, and it takes in x and y as our output. And our best split would return three things to us. What is the feature index on which we are splitting? What is the feature threshold which we use to split? So best split would be a dictionary, and it would return the feature index and feature threshold, right? Once you have these two things, you can split the data into two parts based off of this threshold. So let's split it into two parts. So one we'll call x left and the other one we'll call x right. And similarly for our labels, one we'll call y left and the other one we'll call y right. Now this is very simple. We'll just loop over our data. So xi and yi in x and y. And if xi of that feature index is greater than or equal to the feature threshold that we found, we'll put all of that data onto the right side. So x right will get this xi, and similarly y right will get this yi. Else the data goes on to the left hand side of the tree. So we'll just write it as left and left. Now at this point we are ready to create a node in the tree. So I'm just going to call it node, and this is a tree node. And remember, our tree node takes two things as input, the feature index and the feature threshold. So while generating that, I'm going to pass feature threshold and feature index and return that node, and this node will become a part of our tree. Now we also need to build the tree further down, so we can call our build method recursively once to build the left side of the tree. So we'll call self.build with the left side of the data, so x left and y left. And similarly for the right side of the tree, we'll call the build method with the right hand side data and y right. So this is our very simple training loop. Next up, we need to define this find best split method. So in the find best split method, we take in the input data and the input labels. Let's make sure that both of them are equal in size. Now this returns a dictionary which we'll initialize as an empty dictionary, but this dictionary will contain the best feature index and the threshold for that particular feature. Now this method will go over all of the features that you have, so it will go over all of the possible feature indices. So all of the features, num features is the total number of features that you have. We had initialized that as -1, so we need to reset it before we start training. So let's do that in the fit method, and this will be nothing but the number of columns that you have in the data. So take the first item and then see how many columns that data has. So that's length of that row, and that'll become our number of features. Now for that feature, we need to find out what are the possible values that particular feature can take. So let's call that xi, and let's pluck out the ith all the values for that particular feature. So for xi in feature idx, xi in x. So xi essentially is all the values that the current feature can take. Now any one of these value could be our threshold. So all of these values are potentially a candidate for becoming the final threshold. So I'm just going to call them threshold candidate in sorted set of xi. So set of xi gives you all the unique values that feature can take, and then sorted gives you an ascending those same values in ascending order, right? So those are our threshold candidates. Based off of these threshold candidates, we now can divide our labels again into two parts, one for the left hand side of the tree and one for the right hand side of the tree. So let's go ahead and do that. So y left would become all y's, xi comma y in xi and y, where our xi values are less than the threshold candidate, right? So if the current value, the xi value, is less than the threshold candidate, we put all of those labels onto the left side of the tree. Otherwise, we put them into the right hand side of the tree. So y for if xi is greater than or equal to the threshold candidate. Let's take a zip here. Yeah. So now we have three things. All the labels that are present in the root node, that we are calling y. All the candidates that are present in the left hand, all the labels that are present in the left side of the tree, so that we are calling y left. And similarly, all the labels that are present in the right hand side of the tree, so that we are calling y right. Now, to figure out that whether this is the best split or not, we need to find how much information have we gained by splitting all the y's based off of that current feature and threshold value. So right now I'm just going to call it gain, and we are going to loop over all of the features and all of the threshold values to figure out which split gives us the best gain. We'll talk about what gain is and how we are calculating it, but first let's just go ahead and finish this function and find the best feature and threshold which gives us the highest gain value, right? So we'll say that current gain is nothing but we calculate gain based off of some formula, and that formula takes all the labels in y, all the labels on the left hand side, and all the labels on the right hand side. Now if this current gain is greater than the best gain that we have seen so far, so the best split will have some gain in it, then we'll update the best split dictionary. So best splits new max gain will be the current gain, and best splits feature index will be our current feature index, and best splits feature threshold will be the threshold candidate. Alright, and then finally we'll return this best split dictionary. Since we are doing this over here, we need to set best split of that gain to some very small value in the very beginning so that we can find the maximum value. So let's set that to minus infinity at the very beginning. Now, every number is going to be larger than minus infinity. First time it runs, it will find the best gain, and then it go over all the threshold values, all of the feature indices, and then find what the best gain value is that you can find based off of this calculate method that we are going to be defining next. So gain in decision trees is calculated based off of Gini indices. Mathematically, Gini indices are defined as 1 minus the sum of squares of all probabilities. By all probabilities, I mean probabilities of every class. Let's understand that with an example. So let's say you have a data set which is made up of two classes, pluses and minuses. And in your data set, pluses and minuses are in equal proportion, right? So for this particular data set, your probability of encountering a positive class is 0.5. So that's 3 upon 6. And the probability of encountering a negative class is also 0.5 because they are in equal proportion. So a Gini index for such a data set would be 1 minus square of 0.5 minus square of 0.5. So that will be 0.5. Compare that to a data set which is only made up of one class. Let's say this only has pluses, right? So probability of a positive class in this case would be 1, and probability of a negative class in this case would be 0. So the Gini index over here would be 1 minus 1 square minus 0. So that will be 0, right? So Gini indices come down as the data set becomes more and more homogeneous. If you have a heterogeneous data set which is made up of classes in different two or more classes in different proportions, that will give you a higher Gini index value as compared to a data set which is only made up of one class. So that will give you a Gini index of 0. So whenever we split our parent data, we want the new data sets to have a lower Gini index, and that's where the concept of gain comes from. That when you take a Gini index of a parent and subtract it with the sum of the Gini indices of both the left child and the right child, that value we should be able to maximize. So let's see that in code first. Let's go ahead and define our Gini index method first. So Gini index method would take all the y's that we have and calculate the Gini index for it. So initially our Gini value will be 0, and we'll go over all the classes that we have in self dot classes. Initially we had defined classes as an empty list, so let's update this in our fit method just like the way we updated our num features. So self of classes would be nothing but all the values that y can take. So in our example, self dot classes would be 2 because we only have two kinds of points. Now for each class we want to find its probability. So first let's find the count. So we want to find all the yi's which are equal to this class, and so the probability would be nothing but count of all such data points upon the total number of data points. And finally we add it to our Gini index by squaring it. So that's what we did over here, pi square. So we are finding each pi and then we are squaring it and adding it to our Gini index, and finally we return 1 minus of that Gini value, right? Now this method would be used to calculate the gain. So now let's define this method that we were using down here. So that will take the y of the parent, the y of the left subtree, and y of the right subtree, and then we'll use Gini index to calculate Gini values for all of these three data sets. So the Gini of the parent will be Gini index for y parent. Gini of the left side of the tree would be the Gini index of y left, and Gini of the right side of the tree, Gini index of y right. And now we need to calculate the gain value. So like I said, the gain is nothing but the difference in the Gini values of the parent and the child nodes. So we want to maximize this gain. So whenever we split, we want these two Gini indices to reduce, i.e. we want to split it in such a way that all the classes end up on either side of the tree, and then finally we can return that gain. One last thing we need to add is that we want to weigh these Gini indices based on how much data ended up in each node. So we'll have a weight associated to each side. So the weight on the left hand side would be the number of data points that ended up on the right hand side compared to the number of data points in the parent. So this is just the percentage of data points that ended up on the left side. Similarly, the weight on the right hand side would be the number of data points that ended up on the right hand side upon the number of data points in the parent. So let's take that weight and multiply those with our Gini indices on the right with right, and that's how we get the final gain value that we are using over here. So our decision tree class is almost ready. There's one last thing that we need to do. If you had noticed that the build function that we have written is actually recursive, because build again calls build from within itself, but we have not defined a base condition for it. So we don't know when to stop calling build, right? So we need to define that base condition. Uh, most commonly used, the two most commonly used things to figure out when to stop training is depth and sample size. So what that means is you don't call the build method if you have reached a minimum sample limit, or you don't call build method further if you have reached a maximum depth already. So let's add those two things in. So when we are initializing this tree, we'll say that min samples for split and max depth are defined, and min samples split is min samples split, and max depth is max depth, right? And how do we use these two values is that when we call build, we check whether the number of samples is less than the minimum sample that are required for splitting, or whether the depth of the tree is greater than self.max depth, right? If any of these two things have happened, we can't go and build the tree further down. We have to now build a leaf node. So we need to define depth also, and initially it'll be 0, and as we call the build method again and again, we'll just increment this depth value, right? Once this has happened, what you need to do is build a leaf node, right? So leaf node, let's define that node first. So this will also be a tree node. Yeah, so this one will not have a feature index or a feature threshold, so let's pass that in as -1 and -1. What it does have is that it's a leaf node, so we'll have to set its leaf value to true, and it has to hold the probabilities of the classes that are there in the current dataset that you have. So what is the probability of positive class? So that's nothing but all the yi's which are positive on the total length of y, and what is the probability of the negative class? So that's nothing but 1 minus. So that's nothing but 1 minus probability of the positive class, right? So those are the two things we have to hold, and based off of these two things, we'll finally give a final prediction and return t. Finally, let's add in a predict method so we can predict the classes for new feature vectors. So let's define that predict method, and this will take a feature vector x, and this will use a tree that we have trained. So it'll use the self.tree that we built during the fit method. Let's define a helper method inside this. So this takes the feature vector and the node. Now if the node that you are currently on is a leaf node, that means we can't go further down and we have to return a class prediction. So we'll return a positive prediction if the probability of the positive class is greater than the probability of negative class. Otherwise we'll return the negative class, right? If the leaf node, if you have not reached the leaf node, that means we need to traverse the tree further. So in that leaf node, we'll know which feature index to use for splitting. So that will be the feature index that we'll use to decide which side to go on, and it will also have a threshold. So node dot threshold, I think we called it feature threshold. Yeah, feature threshold. Now if in xi, in the feature vector for that feature index, if the value is greater than or equal to the feature threshold, then we go down the right side of the tree. So we would return predict helper with x, but go down the right side. Otherwise we'll call that same helper method, but we'll go down the left side, right? So if you see here, if the feature vector has the feature index value greater than the threshold, we are putting all of those things in the right side. So similarly, while predicting, we'll use that threshold value to go recurse in the in the right subtree. Otherwise we go recurse in the left subtree, right? And then finally we can call our predict helper method with the feature vector and the tree. So that will give us the final predicted value. Let's run this. Let's instantiate our decision tree. I'm just gonna put 2 as the value for this is the value for min samples split and max depth, right? Let's generate some random data to train on. I'm just gonna copy paste some code from sklearn. So this is the data set on which we want to train the decision tree. As you can see, this data is not linearly separable. This has about 100 samples with some little bit of like 10% noise in it. So let's train our decision tree on this particular data set. So let's call the fit method to train, and it takes x and y. So x are our feature values. So x will contain the values for both the axes, and y is nothing but the labels. So it'll either be 1 or -1. It'll either be a negative class or a positive class. So let's go ahead and fit this tree. Let's visualize how the decision boundaries were made. I'm just going to copy paste some more code for doing that. Yeah, so this is the decision boundary that we got after training the decision tree. Let's increase the depth a bit, and let's retrain the model again. So I'm gonna increase this to 4. Let's see what happens. Yeah, so you see, as you increase the depth, it learned a different decision boundary. It's better than the previous decision boundary because it's able to separate the two different classes almost perfectly. Alright, so that was decision tree. Finally, I want to leave you guys with some advice around how to work with decision trees, how to train your decision trees. So I have 4 pieces of advice for you guys. Number 1 is control the depth of the tree that you're training. If you don't, you are highly likely to overfit on the data set that you have. A good rule of thumb is go with the max depth, which is equal to the square root of the number of features that you have. So for example, if you have 100 features, go with max depth of 10. So that'll be root of 100. Second is min sample split. This is also something that you would like to use if you don't want to overfit on your data set. A good rule of thumb is 5%. So if you have 100 samples, set min sample split to 5. So that's 5% of your data. Third thing is you may have both categorical values and real floating point values as features in your X. So if you do have categorical features, it's good that you encode them as in binary encoding so that the tree is able to figure out when to split on those categorical variables. And finally, try training the decision trees as many times as possible with different data sets just to get a good baseline value, or an idea of what the decision tree is learning. Is it able to robustly make predictions after you train or not? All right, that was decision trees. Thanks everyone.